Picture this. You are a visiting ambassador in the year 1665, summoned to the glittering court of Spain's most powerful monarch. You walk through grand marble corridors, your footsteps echoing under gilded ceilings, expecting to greet a ruler whose very presence radiates command. But when you finally stand before the king, your breath catches. His jaw hangs slack, unable to close, his words spilling out in garbled murmurs you can barely recognize as speech. His body is twisted and frail, his face bearing such unnatural proportions that you wonder if you've stumbled into some waking nightmare. To his own people, he is whispered about as the bewitched one. Yet his condition was not the work of demons, nor the curse of some sorcerer. It was crafted by the very family that put him on the throne. To understand how the throne of Spain, once the most coveted seat of power in Europe, came to be held by a man whose body seemed almost sculpted by misfortune, we must first step into the private, unyielding world of the Habsburg dynasty. For over 200 years, this family reigned over an empire so vast that daylight touched some corner of its territories at every hour of the day. Their dominion stretched across continents, from the hills of Austria to the harbors of the Philippines, from the silver veins of the Americas to the merchant cities of the Low Countries. They ruled through marriage as much as through war, weaving a web of alliances that made them untouchable. But hidden beneath this glittering facade was a belief so dangerous it would undo them from within, the conviction that their royal blood must remain uncontaminated by outsiders, preserved at any cost. This obsession with purity was not the ordinary arrogance of nobles who insisted upon marrying only those of equal rank. It was something far more extreme, a deliberate, generations-long strategy of confining marriage within their own bloodline. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces as brides, aunts were matched to nephews, until the family tree no longer branched outward at all, but folded back upon itself in ever tighter coils. With every generation, the genetic pool became smaller, the risks greater, and the consequences more visible. Yet the Habsburgs believed this was the only way to safeguard their authority, to ensure no foreign family could lay claim to their power. By the time the last Habsburg king of Spain was born, the damage was irreversible. Modern geneticists would later calculate that his inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related his parents were, reached the staggering level of 0.254. To put that in perspective, it was higher than if he had been the child of a brother and sister. And he was not the product of a single disastrous union. His body carried the legacy of 11 consecutive generations of close relative marriages. Normally, a person would have 16 distinct great-grandparents, each contributing to a diverse inheritance of traits. This king had only 6. His ancestry was a maze of repeated names and faces, a closed loop in which certain individuals appeared multiple times in different roles. Anna of Austria, for instance, was simultaneously his aunt, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother. These patterns had been producing visible warning signs for decades, even centuries. The notorious protruding Habsburg jaw had become more pronounced with each generation. Infants were increasingly born sickly, stillbirths became more common, and those who survived often suffered from developmental delays or unexplained illnesses. Royal physicians recorded these concerns in private reports, warning of the dangers of such marriages. Still, the dynasty pressed on, their fear of sharing power outweighing the health of their heirs. In their minds, the idea of mingling their lineage with lesser blood was a far greater danger than any physical weakness. The boy who would become king entered the world on November 6, 1661, in the shadow of this genetic legacy. There were no joyous proclamations ringing through Madrid, no celebratory cannons fired to announce a strong new heir. The midwives present at his birth froze in uneasy silence when they first saw him. His head was disproportionately large, resting on a neck too weak to support it. His eyes were wide-set and bulging, his features skewed by the jutting shape of his jaw. And even as a newborn, his mouth could not fully close, fixed in the gaping position that would torment him for the rest of his life. From that moment, secrecy became as much a part of his upbringing as the silks he wore. The midwives were threatened with execution should they speak of what they had seen. Physicians were ordered to sign statements declaring him perfectly healthy. The few portraits allowed were supervised closely, with strict instructions to improve his features, to soften the angles, to disguise the deformities as much as possible. The outside world was told Spain had a healthy, promising heir. Inside the palace, his very survival was treated as a fragile question. Every stage of his childhood was marked by delays that could not be hidden from those who lived with him. He could not hold up his head until he was 6 years old. He did not walk until the age of 8. He could not form words that anyone could clearly understand until he was 10. And even then, his speech was thick, slurred, and wet. Eating was a daily ordeal. His teeth did not align at all. The upper row sat completely behind the lower, making it impossible to chew. His meals had to be reduced to a paste-like consistency, spooned carefully into his mouth. Even then, food and saliva would spill from his lips, requiring servants to stand by with cloths. The shame of it was as constant as the physical difficulty. He was not entirely unaware of his condition. Court records describe him as often weeping for hours without clear cause, as though he were trapped in a discomfort no one could relieve. Nurses whispered that entering his rooms at night was unsettling, that the sounds he made were not quite human, half-choked cries that made them shiver. Some crossed themselves before approaching his bed, murmuring prayers as if they were in the presence of something touched by the supernatural. When he was 5 years old, the court commissioned the painter Juan Carreño de Miranda to create his first official portrait. The artist, accustomed to capturing royal children in their idealized innocence, was reportedly shaken by what he saw. In private letters, he confessed that the prince's appearance stayed with him long after he left the palace, an image difficult to erase from his mind, even after employing every artistic device to flatter the subject, softening the jaw, narrowing the eyes, adjusting the proportions. The truth bled through the canvas. In those wide-set eyes, there was an intelligence straining against the confines of a broken vessel, a mind aware enough to sense that it was different, yet powerless to understand why. The court tried desperately to hide his disabilities from the outside world. Ceremonies were choreographed to position him in such a way that his deformities were less obvious. Special furniture was designed to obscure the way he stood or sat. Meals with visiting dignitaries were carefully managed, his food prepared in private so no one would witness the messy struggle of him eating. Yet no amount of planning could prevent every slip. On one occasion, a visiting ambassador brought his young son to meet the prince. The boy took one startled look, screamed "monster" in his native tongue, and had to be rushed away. The insult stung, not because it was unexpected, but because it voiced aloud what so many had only thought. From that day forward, the royal household became even more protective, even more secretive. Yet behind the closed doors of the palace there was no denying it. The heir to the most powerful empire in Europe was already a prisoner within his own body, and the world beyond those walls would soon learn just how high the cost of the Habsburgs' obsession with purity had been. As the young prince grew, the Habsburg jaw, that infamous marker of his lineage, reached its most extreme form. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that even when he attempted to close his mouth, a gap remained wide enough to pass coins through. Modern medical experts, studying portraits and written accounts, have suggested he likely suffered from severe mandibular prognathism, macroglossia, an abnormally large tongue, and perhaps even hormonal conditions such as acromegaly. In the 17th century, however, there was no such vocabulary to explain it. Those who met him could only describe what they saw, a king whose face seemed designed not by nature, but by some cruel hand determined to mock the concept of royal perfection. Foreign ambassadors left behind pages of astonished observations. The Venetian envoy remarked that the king's mouth hung perpetually open, like a fish gasping for air. A French diplomat compared the sound of his speech to the drowning gasps of a man slipping beneath the waves. Even those inclined to favour Spain could not disguise their unease. The reality was plain to all who encountered him. Eating and speaking, the most basic human functions, were for the king daily trials. His meals, meant to be grand displays of royal wealth and hospitality, became instead moments of barely contained discomfort for those in attendance. The kitchens were forced to prepare every dish in pureed or liquid form, reducing delicacies to the consistency of baby food. Even then, the act of eating was a laborious and messy process. Soup dribbled from the corners of his mouth, while any solid pieces slipped out entirely. Servants hovered constantly, dabbing at his chin with linen cloths. Onlookers tried to avert their eyes, yet the spectacle was inescapable. For the king, the humiliation was as constant as the physical difficulty, and over time he withdrew from public banquets altogether. It was better to eat alone than endure the silent pity, or worse, the concealed revulsion of his court. His speech impediment was an equally cruel burden. The same deformities that disrupted his eating rendered his voice thick and indistinct. Words emerged slurred and wet, requiring those around him to strain to understand even the simplest phrases. Foreign envoys often needed interpreters, not to bridge a difference in language, but to translate the sounds of their own tongue into something intelligible. In matters of state, this limitation created a serious problem. Proclamations that should have carried the commanding clarity of a monarch had to be painstakingly transcribed by scribes, sometimes with uncertain accuracy, as even those closest to him could not always be sure what he had meant to say. The strain of this communication barrier was not just political, it was personal. Surviving letters in the king's own hand, marked by shaky script, reveal flashes of self-awareness and deep frustration. In one, he laments that he is a prisoner within my own flesh, and reflects bitterly that God had made him sovereign over the greatest realm on earth, as a form of cosmic jest. Such moments of candidness were rare, yet they show a mind capable of recognizing, however painfully, the distance between his role and his reality. The damage wrought by centuries of inbreeding was not confined to his jaw or speech. His entire body bore the mark of genetic collapse. At 35 years old, he resembled a child stretched into awkward adulthood. Small in stature, scarcely taller than 5 feet, yet with a head disproportionately large for his thin skeletal frame. His limbs were narrow and frail, his torso short and compressed, and his back bent by a severe curvature of the spine that left him with a perpetual stoop. This posture, combined with the oversized head, gave him the appearance of one who carried an unseen weight, though in truth the burden was written into every part of him. His development had been so delayed that he did not take his first unassisted steps until the age of 8. Even then, walking was more of a shuffling lurch than a stride, and he often needed to steady himself against walls or furniture. Court documents describe the sight of the young king moving through his chambers like a man decades older, halting and unsure. There was no possibility of him participating in the physically demanding pursuits that other noble youths enjoyed. He could not hunt, could not ride for long without discomfort, and could not endure the rigours of military inspection without visibly tiring. Mentally, too, the damage was clear. His tutors, men trained to educate princes in languages, politics, and the art of governance, often likened the effort to filling a cracked vessel. Knowledge poured in but seemed to seep away almost as quickly. Even into his adult years, his comprehension of complex matters was limited, and his ability to retain new information unreliable. Emotional control was another casualty. Palace servants recorded frequent tantrums, fits of shouting and flailing sparked by the smallest frustrations, followed by long spells of near catatonic withdrawal, where he would sit staring into nothingness for hours. The physical signs of decline were matched by outward markers of fragility. His hair grew thin and patchy, often falling out in irregular clumps that revealed a pale, uneven scalp. Court painters, bound to flatter their subject, were forced to paint fuller hair than existed, just as they softened the lines of his face and narrowed the jut of his jaw. His skin was pale to the point of translucence, prone to unexplained rashes that resisted every known treatment. Even in the warmth of the Spanish climate, he complained of being cold, wearing multiple layers that exaggerated the odd proportions of his frame. One detail, perhaps the most unsettling to those around him, was the peculiar odour that seemed to cling to him. It was not overpowering, nor necessarily foul, but it carried a strange, sour-sweet quality that hinted at something awry deep within. Some modern researchers have speculated that it may have been caused by metabolic disorders linked to his extreme inbreeding. To his contemporaries, though, it was yet another feature that set him apart, something whispered about in the shadows of the court. Yet the greatest crisis facing the Spanish crown was not merely the health of the man who wore it, but the fact that he could not, and never would, produce an heir. The continuation of the Habsburg line in Spain depended entirely on his ability to father a child, and with each passing year that hope grew fainter. Twice he married. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess whose arrival in Spain was greeted with diplomatic fanfare, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, chosen for her family's history of fertility. In both cases, the unions were doomed from the start, for the king's body was as unprepared for reproduction as it was for governance. His sexual development had been stunted, leaving him physically incapable of consummating the marriage. Rather than acknowledge this reality, the court sought scapegoats. In the case of Marie-Louise, it was easier to blame her for failing to conceive than to admit that the fault lay with the king himself. She was subjected to a series of humiliating examinations and archaic treatments, forced to drink bitter concoctions, and placed under constant pressure from both church and court. The emotional toll was devastating. Letters to her family speak of isolation, despair, and a husband she described as more pitiful than frightening. When she died suddenly at the age of 26, the official cause was given as appendicitis, though whispers of suicide lingered. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, the damage to Spain's political position was already profound. Without an heir, the question of succession loomed like a storm cloud over Europe, and every court from Paris to Vienna began to maneuver for the inevitable, the death of a king who could not leave behind a son. When physicians could not offer an explanation for the king's ailments, let alone a cure, the Spanish court began to look elsewhere for answers. In the world of the 17th century, where medicine was primitive and superstition ran deep, the line between sickness and sorcery was easily blurred. It did not take long for whispers to circulate through the corridors of Madrid. Perhaps the king's condition was not the work of nature at all, but of malice. Some said he was the victim of a curse placed upon the Habsburg line, others that demons had been invited into his body by enemies of the crown. The Church, wielding enormous influence over both politics and daily life, seized upon these fears and offered a familiar remedy: exorcism. What followed was unlike anything in the history of the Spanish monarchy. These were not quiet rituals performed in hidden chapels. They were grand spectacles staged in the very heart of royal power, conducted before nobles, clergy, and foreign dignitaries. The chief architect of these ceremonies was Father Antonio Fernandez de Andrada, the court's appointed exorcist, who declared publicly that the king harboured not one but multiple evil spirits. According to him, these entities had been placed within the king through witchcraft, with the deliberate aim of weakening Spain itself. The exorcisms began in the throne room, transformed for the occasion into a theatre of spiritual warfare. At the centre sat the king, pale and visibly frail, flanked by priests clutching crucifixes and relics. Father Andrada would begin by pressing a cross to the king's forehead and commanding the spirits to depart in a booming voice that echoed against the gilded walls. Then came the ingestion of holy water, not the clear, clean liquid one might imagine, but water into which fragments of sacred relics, bone, cloth, and splinters of wood said to be from the true cross, had been ground. The result was a gritty, cloudy mixture that the king swallowed under the watchful eyes of the assembled court. The effect was immediate and violent. The king would double over, retching, the liquid burning his throat and stomach. Vomit would follow, spattering onto the floor, while Father Andrada proclaimed to the onlookers that this was proof of the demons being driven out. At times the king would shake uncontrollably, his thin frame convulsing in the chair until attendants had to steady him. On other occasions he would lose consciousness entirely, only to be revived with more holy water and shouted incantations in Latin, a language he barely understood. Ambassadors who witnessed these scenes described them in letters home with a mixture of horror and fascination. A Venetian observer wrote that the sessions resembled more the tortures of war than the rites of the church. A French envoy claimed he had seen less distress in men wounded on the battlefield. And yet, for all their brutality, the ceremonies continued, each one reinforcing the belief that the king's suffering was spiritual rather than physical in origin. As the months passed, the scope of the exorcisms widened. It was no longer enough to cleanse the king himself. The palace too was deemed under attack. In 1698, Father Andrada ordered a full-scale purification of the royal residence. Servants were instructed to gather every object that might be tainted by witchcraft, gifts from foreign courts, personal possessions of former queens, even furniture and tapestries that had been in the palace for decades. These items were carried into the courtyard and piled high into great bonfires. Priests encircled the flames, chanting prayers as thick, acrid smoke rose into the sky, visible from the city beyond. Citizens of Madrid, seeing the plumes, speculated wildly about what calamity had befallen their rulers. The truth, that the king's household was burning its own treasures to ward off unseen enemies, was stranger than any rumour. The king himself believed in the process with a desperate sincerity. His mental limitations and constant pain made him vulnerable to suggestion, and when told that the demons were being expelled, he seemed to feel genuine relief. For days after an exorcism, he would sometimes appear calmer, less agitated, convincing himself that the invisible assault had been repelled. But the relief never lasted. Inevitably the symptoms returned, and with them his pleas for another session. This cycle became a grim routine in the final years of his life. Palace records indicate that he underwent more than 50 formal exorcisms between 1695 and 1700, each one leaving him weaker than before. His body, already worn down by decades of illness, could not endure such repeated strain without consequence. After some sessions, he was unable to rise from bed for days, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing shallow. Still, he insisted on continuing, convinced that without constant spiritual defense, the devils within would gain the upper hand. For the court, these public rituals were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they reinforced the narrative that the king's condition was the result of witchcraft, diverting attention from the politically dangerous truth of his inbreeding. On the other, they exposed the monarch to humiliation before the eyes of the world. Foreign powers saw not the grandeur of Spanish sovereignty, but a trembling figure subjected to theatrical spiritual assaults, too weak to defend himself or his kingdom. Diplomats reported home that Spain's power was a hollow shell, its ruler reduced to little more than a figurehead, or worse, a cautionary tale. And yet no one in the palace seemed able to break free from the delusion. To challenge the exorcisms would be to admit that the king's afflictions were irreversible, that nothing could restore him to the strength and dignity a monarch required. So the rituals continued, each one more elaborate than the last, until they became as much a part of the royal calendar as audiences and state dinners. The irony was cruel. In seeking to purge imagined demons, the court only deepened the real tragedy. The physical toll of these ceremonies hastened the king's decline, sapping what little vitality remained to him. His reign, already overshadowed by frailty and political instability, now became defined by the image of a monarch writhing under the hands of priests, his crown resting uneasily upon a head that could scarcely hold itself upright. By the dawn of the new century, the Spanish people had grown used to the rumors that their king was bewitched, that evil forces had infiltrated the palace, that only constant prayer kept disaster at bay. But among the more clear-eyed members of the court, a quieter fear was taking hold. The king's health was failing rapidly, and with no heir to succeed him, Spain stood on the edge of a crisis that could engulf all of Europe. The royal bloodline, guarded so jealously for centuries, was about to end with the very man it had destroyed. The decline of the last Habsburg king was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, merciless unravelling. Each year stripping away another fragment of his strength. By the final stretch of his reign, his body had become a fragile, distorted framework barely capable of carrying its own weight. His face, the very emblem of his dynasty's centuries-old policy of pure blood, was now the most damning evidence of its failure. The jaw that had once defined the Habsburg profile had grown into a grotesque exaggeration, projecting forward in a way that made even simple expressions appear strained and unnatural. His teeth, misaligned and crowded, could not meet. His enlarged tongue filled much of his mouth, pressing against his teeth and distorting his speech until his words became a low, muffled murmur that few could comprehend without effort. The rest of his body was no less marked by the genetic legacy he carried. His stature, scarcely above 5 feet, was compounded by the disproportion of his limbs, arms and legs that seemed too thin for the weight of his head, a torso that appeared compressed, and a curvature of the spine that forced him forward into a permanent stoop. Observers often noted that he moved as though carrying an unseen load on his back, yet the true burden was in every cell of his body, woven into the very fabric of his being by centuries of consanguinity. His hair, once a symbol of royal youth, had thinned into uneven patches that exposed a blotched, pale scalp, while his skin, sickly and prone to rashes, gave off an unhealthy pallor that no amount of powder or finery could disguise. Despite the countless physicians who had attended him over the years, there was no real attempt at treatment in the modern sense. Medicine in 17th century Spain had little understanding of genetics, and the remedies offered ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. Bloodletting was performed to balance the humours, leaving him weakened for days. Strange herbal concoctions were brewed and forced upon him, sometimes laced with metals or minerals thought to restore vitality. None of it altered his condition, and most of it only served to worsen his already fragile state. In the absence of meaningful medical intervention, superstition filled the void. The exorcisms, purifications, and burning of suspected cursed objects had already become part of his routine, but these were joined by a variety of quasi-religious rituals aimed at summoning divine favour. Relics were brought from distant monasteries and held before him as he prayed. Saints' bones were pressed to his forehead. Holy oils were smeared along his jaw in the hope of restoring speech and strength. Courtiers whispered about the possibility of miracles, though in private many understood that no amount of devotion could reverse what nature had already decided. Politically, the situation was becoming untenable. Spain, once the unchallenged master of the seas, was losing its grip on its vast empire. Wars had drained the treasury, rebellions had shaken its provinces, and rivals like France and England were quick to exploit any sign of weakness. All the while, the man nominally in command of the kingdom could barely manage the simplest acts of governance. Important state business had to be conducted in writing. His proclamations dictated slowly to scribes who often had to guess at his meaning. Foreign policy was increasingly shaped by advisors and regents, their decisions presented to the king more as formalities than matters requiring his judgment. Yet the matter that overshadowed all others was the absence of an heir. His marriages, intended to secure the future of the dynasty, had failed in the most fundamental way. The physical incapacity that made consummation impossible was an open secret in the court, though officially the blame was placed elsewhere. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen specifically for her family's reputation for fertility. But even she could not fulfill the role expected of her. Not because of her own health, but because the king's body could not perform the act required to produce a child. To admit this publicly would have been to acknowledge the complete failure of the Habsburg line in Spain. So instead the fiction was maintained, with physicians declaring that her inability to conceive was a mysterious ailment. The queen, much like her predecessor, endured invasive and humiliating examinations, along with a host of bizarre treatments meant to prepare her body for conception. These ranged from diets rich in exotic ingredients to prolonged prayer vigils and the wearing of blessed garments said to encourage fertility. The court's desperation was such that any suggestion, no matter how absurd, was seized upon as a possible solution. Behind the polite formality of state ceremonies, the atmosphere was one of quiet panic, for everyone knew that without a direct heir, Spain's future was uncertain at best and catastrophic at worst. This looming crisis extended beyond Spain's borders. The other great powers of Europe were already positioning themselves for the inevitable succession struggle. France's Louis XIV eyed the Spanish inheritance for his own dynasty, while the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs prepared their claim. Diplomats from across the continent engaged in a delicate game of alliances and promises, each maneuver calculated with the understanding that the death of the childless king would unleash a conflict that could engulf much of Europe. Meanwhile, within the walls of the royal palace, the king himself seemed only dimly aware of the political storm gathering around him. His days were spent in a repetitive cycle of religious observance, short audiences with select advisors, and the constant, exhausting struggle with his own failing body. He remained convinced that his troubles were the work of supernatural forces, and that salvation might yet come through the intercession of the saints or the expulsion of the last stubborn demons. Each new ceremony or blessing brought a brief flicker of hope, quickly extinguished when the familiar pain and weakness returned. To those who saw him in his final years, he was a figure both pitiable and unsettling. The deformities that had been partially concealed in his youth were now impossible to hide, the signs of deterioration etched deeply into his face and frame. His voice, never clear, had grown softer and more strained, sometimes failing entirely, so that he had to communicate through gestures or written notes. His appetite, always poor, diminished further, leaving him thin to the point of frailty. Servants spoke of his increasing isolation, how he would sit for hours in silence, his gaze unfocused, as though looking at something beyond the walls of his chamber. And yet, for all the suffering and humiliation, he remained the king, a symbol of the Habsburg name and the empire it had once commanded. His very existence was a living testament to the dynasty's fatal choice, the embodiment of what happens when the pursuit of political purity overrides the most basic laws of nature. As his health declined and the end drew nearer, the question was no longer whether the Habsburg rule in Spain would end with him, but how violent and far-reaching the consequences of that ending would be. The final months of the king's life unfolded under a heavy shadow, each day marked by the steady erosion of a body already pushed to its limits. His movements became slower, his voice a faint rasp, his once restless eyes dulled by exhaustion. The exorcisms, purifications, and prayers that had defined so much of his later reign no longer brought even temporary relief. Whatever strength he had once been able to summon in the face of his ailments was gone, leaving only a quiet resignation. The court, long accustomed to managing the public image of their monarch, could not disguise the truth any longer. Spain's king was dying, and with him would die the bloodline that had dominated Europe for generations. By the time the year 1700 drew to its close, the king's physical decline was impossible to ignore. His body, already frail, seemed to shrink further, his skin clinging tightly to the bone as if the flesh itself were abandoning him. He could no longer walk unaided, and even sitting upright for more than a few minutes caused him visible strain. Meals, reduced to thin broths and soft pastes, were taken in small quantities, his appetite nearly gone. Sleep brought little rest. Nights were broken by long bouts of laboured breathing and the occasional fit of coughing that left him pale and trembling. Courtiers moved through the palace with hushed voices, as if the very air had become heavy with anticipation. On November 1, 1700, the end came quietly. Surrounded by priests and a handful of attendants, the king slipped away without ceremony, his death more a slow extinguishing than a dramatic collapse. The news spread quickly, carried first through the corridors of the palace and then out into the streets of Madrid, where it was met with a mixture of sorrow, relief, and uncertainty. For the people of Spain, the passing of their king was not just the loss of a sovereign, but the closing of an entire chapter of their history. Custom dictated that the body of the monarch be examined, both as a matter of record and as a final attempt to understand the causes of his suffering. The autopsy, performed in the cold light of the palace's surgical chamber, revealed a catalogue of abnormalities so severe that those present could scarcely believe they belonged to a single human being. The king's heart was described as no larger than a walnut, its size and condition incapable of sustaining vigorous life. His lungs were blackened and riddled with fluid. His intestines, abnormally swollen, contained signs of chronic infection. Most astonishing of all was the state of his head. The skull was unusually large and heavy, and inside it, the brain was filled with fluid, a condition that modern medicine would identify as hydrocephalus. The surgeon who recorded these findings noted grimly that the body appeared not of one creature, but of many, as though mismatched parts had been assembled without harmony. These revelations confirmed what the court had always feared, but never openly admitted. The physical ruin of the king was the inevitable result of the Habsburg dynasty's centuries-long insistence on marrying within its own ranks. In their pursuit of political control and dynastic purity, they had engineered the slow destruction of their own line. The irony was profound. The very trait they had sought to preserve had, over generations, become the instrument of their undoing. The political consequences of his death were immediate and far-reaching. With no direct heir to claim the Spanish throne, the question of succession erupted into a crisis that drew in the great powers of Europe. France, Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic all had stakes in the outcome, and within months diplomacy gave way to open conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest and most expansive conflicts of the early 18th century, was the direct legacy of the king's inability to produce an heir. In a sense, the war was his final act, the last ripple of a reign defined by weakness, dependency, and the slow disintegration of a once mighty empire. Yet beyond the politics and the bloodshed, his story stands as a kind of cautionary monument. His life was a living demonstration of what happens when power is placed above all else, above health, above reason, above the most basic understanding of human survival. The Habsburgs believed their bloodline was so superior that it could not be diluted without losing its strength. In truth, it was that very refusal to mix with the outside world that stripped it of its vitality generation by generation until it could no longer sustain even the simplest functions of life. When portraits of the king now hang in museums, they are often surrounded by the trappings of royal dignity, fine clothing, elaborate jewelry, the subtle artistry of a court painter's touch. But look closely, and the truth bleeds through the oil and varnish, the heavy jaw, the distant gaze. the awkward proportions that no amount of skill could disguise. These images are not just relics of a past monarch, they are the final, permanent record of a dynasty's fatal arrogance. In the end, the king's legacy is written not in victories or reforms, but in the twisted symmetry of his bones and the hollow shell of his empire. Nature had delivered its verdict on the Habsburg experiment, and it was etched in every feature of the last Spanish king's face. The empire that had once spanned the globe crumbled not under the assault of foreign armies, but under the weight of its own mistakes, mistakes that took flesh and breath in the man who wore its crown. For the people of Spain, his passing marked both an ending and a warning. Dynasties rise and fall, but the lesson of the last Habsburg king endures. No amount of political power can exempt a family from the laws of nature, and no crown can protect against the consequences of defying them. His life and death remain a testament to the truth that an empire's greatest threat may not come from beyond its borders, but from the choices made within its own blood.